Well, welcome everybody. This is Bridget Farrell from the ARC New York, and I'd like to welcome you to the 72nd annual meeting of the ARC New York. Today we have a session on the desperation cycle where we'll hear from Margaret Gould and Marco Damiani. And I also wanted to let you know I muted everyone upon entry into the session, and we would like you to keep your mics on mute. And after the session is completed, we will take questions in the chat box and as well as the raise hand function. So now I'm going to turn it over to Marco.
Thank you, Bridget, and welcome everybody. My name is Marco Damiani. I'm the CEO at AHRC New York City, and I'm proud to be partnering today with Peg Gould. Peg, you're on mute.
I am on mute. Hi, I'm Peg Gould. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Vision Center for Creative Management, and I direct the training collaborative in New York City.
And I'm also proud to say that AHRC New York City is one of a number of agencies in the downstate area participating in that collaborative. So thank you, Peg, for your leadership there. So let's start. So living in the moment has its upsides and its downsides, right? Mindfulness tells us to live in the moment, but we can't be stuck there in a workforce crisis. We're here today to talk to you about the many downsides of staying in the moment and how we can help you get a longer view of the horizon ahead. The word unprecedented has been overused in the last 18 months, probably more than ever. In fact, unprecedented has been used an unprecedented number of times. That said, it's all true. Providers are working every day in every way to keep heads above water, people in vital positions, and services maintained. What is it about the urgency and emergency that solves one problem and creates another? I would say it might be a little like the fight or flight response. Our brains are wired to respond to threats, and when we behave that way, it's hard for us to look beyond the threat. That said, today we're going to talk about how to take time to peek over the horizon and give you some ideas about how we all can work together to not only praise and respect the work of DSPs, full stop, and other staff, but also to ensure we're devoting time, effort, and resources to recruiting the very best, keeping the very best, and politely getting rid of the ones that don't meet our standards. It's hard to do nowadays. No one wants to be mediocre, right? Let's face it. Today, perhaps we're a little more mediocre than we want to be. So let's commit to exceeding expectations and break the desperation cycle. Peg has some slides we're going to go through. We're going to have kind of a conversation through this presentation, and certainly hope you have time for questions and comments at the end. So Peg, please.
Okay, so we call this the desperation cycle. What is the desperation cycle? So it's really a lack of proactive planning. We go through periods of high unemployment and periods of low unemployment, and basically the organization is struggling to respond to the circumstances that are at hand without necessarily having a long-term vision. And that's what we want to talk about, how to get out of the speculative role that we've been in, that happens in the field, because this isn't the first time that unemployment has been extremely difficult, and finding qualified staff has been difficult. So go to the next slide. So I put here, desperation doesn't mean respite. And what that means is that hiring a warm body, you can find somebody to fill in. And I know sometimes you don't feel you can find a person under a rock, but we can find some warm bodies. But that does not mean that that person is going to give us any respite. As a matter of fact, that desperation hire is going to cause us more problems on the back end than the front end, because normally they end up being a C-D pluser, somebody that I say wants a job, but it doesn't really have the heart, doesn't really have the commitment. A C-D pluser is someone who does enough to stay employed, but not enough to do you any good. Physically present, brain dead. And the problem with the C-D plus desperation hire is that they burn out your A plusers, more or less, they basically suck the energy out of everybody. And so, yes, do you have a physical body there? Yes. But it's not somebody that in the long run is going to do you much good. And the problem with C minus D plusers is that they don't go away. So in periods where it's easier to hire, they usually are still around because they don't have enough water in their well to go look for another job. So they stay with you. And often what happens as a result is that you'll bring in new competent staff, but you've got this lingering group. And then when you go back into hard time finding staff again, they stay, but they really hurt you as you're hiring new people because they're often the ones that make that new employee orientation less than desirable. There's a lot of statistics, a lot of agencies will tell you they hire somebody, within the first 2 weeks, the new hire wants to quit. And that's because they walked into a culture that's totally compromised. And, you know, so I talk about inspiration, not desperation, meaning that if you're going to hire somebody because you just need somebody, in the first 3 weeks of that employment, you have to inspire them as to what the mission is. And if that doesn't happen, then you need to cut your losses as soon as you can, because a lot of people pass probation by default. Manager's busy, running around, time frame happens, whether it's 3 months or 6 months, and before you know it, this person's a full-time staff person, and now trying to deal with them in any kind of HR system, whether you're unionized or not, becomes problematic. Go to the next.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, just to build on what Peg's saying, it's so important, this conversation, just in the very beginning. We have a leadership summit at HRC New York City, and it's been harder during the pandemic to do that. We're still having one in a couple of months. But we had one just pre-pandemic, and one of the things that we committed to was to bring in outside leaders, outside of our industry, outside of our field, to help inspire our leadership to think about how they can be even better at what they do. And we brought in the chief operating officer of Union Square Hospitality Group. If you're a New York City person, you know that that's Danny Meyer's restaurant group. You know, Danny Meyer is one of the leading restaurateurs in the world. And his chief operating officer came in and talked with us, our 400 managers. And he happened to have a daughter with Down syndrome, which gave it an even more inspiring perspective. But what he talked to us about, it was really interesting. He said a couple of things. The first is he asked the group, who do we care most about at the Union Square Hospitality Group? And of course, people shouting out, oh, it's the patron, it's the diner. And he said, no, it's not. It's each other. We care about each other first, and then we care about the diners, the patrons, because if we don't care about each other, we can't do a good job providing the best possible service in a world-class restaurant. And then he also said something really critical, and it still resonates with our management team. He said, we try to hire 51 percenters. So what's that? What the heck is 51 percenter? And he said, we can teach the basics of good hospitality to almost anybody. How to pour a bottle of wine, how to set a table, how to greet somebody. We cannot teach somebody to have a hospitable heart and a kind demeanor. So the reason this resonates is that we have to hire 51 percenters. And I think Peg made that point when she talked about inspiration, not desperation. It's not easy to do, but you can teach most of these skills with a really good training program and good supervision. You got to hire the people that fit into your culture, that are those 51 percenters. Really a critical thing to do, and hard to do when we're in a workforce crisis like this, but you can still find those people. They might take a little more training, a little more effort, but you're better off with a 51 percenter than a 49 percenter, because sooner or later, that 49 percenter is going to become the mediocre, negative influence that Peg's mentioned before.
Absolutely. And desperation, people hire saying just anybody, and that is not respite. I keep trying to say to managers, I know you're flat out. I understand it. But in the end, this person's going to cause you more problems. It doesn't solve the problem. But we're going to talk about, that's part of having the long-term view. It's not solving the immediate problem. It's looking at how I'm going to build forward. So go to the next slide. One of the other things that a lot of organizations are talking about is what I call net zero. And that's that for as many people as you hire, you've lost the same number of people. So one of the things with a long view is that you have to look at the whys, the datas, what's going on. Why do you constantly come to net zero? So a lot of organizations are working hard to bring people in, but meanwhile, they're burning their staff out and not doing anything in terms of retention. Now, you're going to hear me say this again later, but a closet of goodies, you did a good job, go get yourself a little goodie out of the goodie basket closet, is not a retention strategy. That lasts about 22 nanoseconds. Sometimes a genuine thank you from your supervisor is far more powerful a retention tool than giving somebody a $25 gift card. So if you're playing the net zero game, then you have to look at what are the factors that are causing that. And I know that everybody's stressed, but it's kind of like a balance. You have to make sure that you're not overly doing the recruiting side without making sure you're looking at the retention side. And you've also got to look at when you're hiring, if you're bringing people in, how long are they staying? Because if people are cliffing or leaving before the 3-month mark, then you know that yes, you're onboarding, but you're not onboarding effectively. Net zero also happens if you're not efficient and fast in the hiring process. There's signs that say, apply today, start to work tomorrow. Well, we can't do that. So we have to stay in constant contact with the person we want to hire. We have to keep drawing them into the system so that, again, you're not net zeroing. So they're not leaving before they even start the job or not showing up to the first day of orientation. All of that is sort of a systemic evaluation, looking at the data, what's happening to you. Go to the next slide. Okay, so let's look at what the current unemployment situation is and what's going on in terms of moving forward. So we know that in September, not a lot of jobs were created, but we also know that a lot of jobs weren't created because people couldn't fill the jobs that they currently have. And so there's sort of a delicious dilemma to that. Less jobs, less opportunity to lose staff, potential staff, but there's a lot of jobs hanging around that need to be filled, existing jobs. Unemployment fell to 4.7%, but wages increased by 4.5%. This is a sweet spot for us because we simply don't have the funding to keep up with some of the incentives that other companies are doing. We got the money we got in our pocket, right? So what we have to do is look at what our competitive position is in relationship to that. What can we offer if it's not a higher per hour wage? Security, long-term stability of the organizations, the fact that you get something out of this job that you can't get out of cooking at McDonald's. And by the way, I do not feel our job is equivalent to a McDonald's job. It drives me crazy when people talk about that. There's a lot of part-time discouraged workers, and that fell to 8.5%, but part-time may be something to start looking at. And if you can't hire full-time staff, can you piece it together with some part-timers people that are looking for a second income or have a particular issue at home. We know that a lot of moms, single moms, work in our industry, but they have daycare issues. And so can I somehow piece together schedules? And we also know that people are looking at reassessing their career paths after the pandemic. So how can we promote our job as a career option and a career alternative? Part of it is what we say about ourselves, because we are a good industry and our jobs are good jobs. Yes, they don't pay top dollar, but the compensation is a reasonable compensation. It should be a lot more, but it's a reasonable compensation. Almost all organizations have benefit packages that you can't find in other places. We do have a story to tell. And I know when Marco and I talked, we talked about that. What story are we telling about ourselves? You know?
I think it's key. Peg, thanks for saying this. Sorry, Peg. We did say back and forth here, so it's kind of over. We can't stand next to each other. But, you know, I want to touch on something that Peg started to talk about here. You know, take a look at your job postings, both internal and external. And if they, and by the way, we're working on this as well. If your job posting talks about a lot of what and not a lot of why, you have to rethink it. Because the work that our DSPs do, and we all do, is not just transactional. As important as transactions are, transactions keep the trains running. But why we do it is what's so empowering. What drives people to come to us. We're a social justice organization. We're a social justice field. We believe in disability rights. We believe in inclusion. And that language will attract certain people. As much as we value, and I certainly value, my aunt is in Florida right now in home care and she's not doing great. I really value the person that's helping her. That's different than what we do. So your efforts to recruit people has to be grounded in a why. Make sure you know your why. You hear this all the time, but it's true. That will help attract the right people and keep the right people, because once they're in, you need to continue that conversation and reinforce, you know, why you exist as an organization. Thanks, Peg.
No, absolutely. And you need to also look at your job posting. If it looks like everybody else's job posting for DSPs, why pick you? You need to let people know what your competitive advantage is, why working for you is really the place. You're the employer of choice. And I know that we don't think of ourselves as marketers. So the other thing that I've recommended to people is, if when in doubt, steal some ideas. What are other places you, how does McDonald's has to recruit folks. What are they saying in their videos? What are they saying in their ads? What is Google saying in their ads? You know, yes, we don't have a multi-million-dollar marketing department, but a good idea is a good idea. But if your job posting sounds like every other, because if you look on Indeed, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of DSP postings. They all look identically the same. And so what do I pick? The first one I see, the one closest to my house? I mean, that's not the way to recruit. And everybody's using the same vehicles. You have to use different vehicles. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Go to the next slide. I just wanted to show you that when you talk about this cycle, there's ups and downs with employment. You know, of course, the one on the far left was the depression. So that was an outlier. But if you look at what's happened over time, various years, you know, and what was going on in the country at this period of time, there were periods of time when recruitment was not that difficult. Truthfully, you know, there were a lot of people looking for jobs and you could be very selective, and you had a group of people that came in that kind of understood what a caregiver's job was. The issue with where we are today is a combination of factors. One is very low unemployment. And second, what Marco and I were talking about, this is the first year, last year and this year, that you probably had an applicant with a birth date of 20 something. Yes, the Z Gen are now entering the workforce because it's 2021. We're getting some of who we're trying to recruit are very different people than the baby boomer or transitional gen that you might have been trying to recruit in the 80s or the 90s. And we have to appeal to folks in terms of where they are. In this cycle also, you're going to have a diversity of generations, everything from baby boomers all the way through X gens. And we have to manage a workforce that come from very different angles. I was telling Marco, I went to a new employee orientation and they handed out paper and there were some young people that were there and they looked at it like, paper? I remember what this was. And they had to write something down and it almost was aversive conditioning. It was like, where's my computer? I can't just plunk in the numbers. Text it to me on my iPhone. Seriously, you want me to sit here and use a pen? And it's archaic thing called paper. They're just different people. You looked at the PowerPoint and the PowerPoint was decent, but it was circa 1990. You know, a Z Gen person, no movement, no colors, just this boring, get through the thing. It's no wonder that person wouldn't stay. I would not be surprised if you analyze the statistics that individuals who have gone through that are probably schooled in a whole different way of how to apply for a job and what their expectations once there. Go to the next slide. So this is again, just a period of high and low what was going on with us as a field. It was during from the 1980s to 2000, unemployment started at 6.7%, just about the time Willowbrook's case was settled in 75. And in the early 80s was the time when we were doing a lot of growth. We had hiring wasn't bad. We were able to develop programs quickly. We know even during the 2001, 2007 period of time, just past the September 11th, when the economy right-sized again and it realigned, we were beginning to have some issues as those years progressed. By 2007, just before the Great Recession, I was teaching guerrilla recruitment and retention, literally fighting for staff. We could be repeating the same behavior now. We were having a really tough time. After the Great Recession, people took a deep breath and, unemployment was high, economic crisis, hiring eased, we were growing. It felt like a relief. But the inevitable next situation was going to happen. The next cycle was going to happen. Now, there might be some people on this call that are saying, then all I have to do is wait a couple of years. Everything will crash and burn and my problem will be solved. But that's not the factors of what the prediction is. So go to the next slide. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Unemployment has actually been decreasing since 2008. The projection is by 2030, unemployment will only increase to 4.5%, which is basically low unemployment. It's basically 2022. So for the next 8 years, the projection is we're going to be grinding through. Go to the next slide. So not only are we grinding through without a lot of people, we've also hit a point In all of the previous cycles, we had not grown as a system as large as we are today. We have so many more group homes and so many more day programs and so many more independent living settings. But the pool for candidates has remained very small. When you look at the right person who really is the right individual for this job, it's never been a large recruitment pool. And that recruitment pool is getting tighter because you've got more competition. We're aging as a society. There is more services and supports in other areas, and the responsibilities for the DSPs are growing. We also grew with a set of theories and philosophies where we didn't want group homes, for example, on top of each other. So we have a lot of diversity in terms of location, which was fine from a philosophical point of view. From a logistical point of view, to redeploy staff to cover is extremely harsh because you don't have facilities close to one another. It doesn't make it easy. And we now have mandation. And mandation is causing huge issues because a lot of our staff are single moms. If you're on a 3 to 11 shift and you get mandated, what happens to the children? I got to get home. And so I think that mandation, the whole idea of staffing coverage. So what I said on the next slide, go to the next slide, is that we have to do some reassessment. We have to kind of look at, we're a mature system at this point. We've grown to a point, and that's good and that's great. But just like any other business, you have to look at where your locations are. Does some of the sites make sense anymore? How are you going to manage this resource called the human resource to the maximum? If I'm going to be in a tough staffing pattern, then I have to utilize my staff extremely effectively. And so I have to reassess. I have to reassess how I'm using IT. I have to reassess where people are deployed to. And I have to look at how my staff are assigned. With mandation, am I shooting myself in the foot by assigning some individuals to settings where if they're mandated, they're going to have to leave because it just can't cover? Now, Marco, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I do. I want to build on some of the good stuff you're saying, Peg. First, just to reinforce the expand the pool. Think out of the box is such a not out of the box thing to say, but I just said it. And I think we have to really start thinking about how do we expand the pool. And, you know, I do orientation every 2 weeks in person in the old days and not so much now, but we would have people that worked in restaurants, people actually that were in the trades. And they got through our interview process and we thought they'd be good at what they do. Now, I don't have the data in front of me as to whether they succeeded or not, but I think we have to think that way. Going back to the 51%er framework, there are 51%ers that work outside of our human services industry or outside of our DD industry for sure. So I think this goes back to this recruitment thing. Also, I think it's critical that we know the cost of retention versus the cost of recruiting and onboarding. And you should know those costs. I mean, there's some studies on this. I hear the number $5,000 per person often and higher than that. That's a lot of money to be spending to bring people on board. We have an 18% turnover rate at HRC New York City. That's not bad for the overall field. That's like over 800 people a year for us, maybe even 1,000, depending on how particular year. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of staff time. Now we have to do it because we're onboarding those people. But is there a way to redirect those resources, those dollars that we're spending on that process to really keep people? And then obviously you got to measure all this stuff. And I think that's an important thing to know. You should know some basic things. What is your sweet spot? How long do your staff typically how long does it typically take for them to stay with you? Now, for us, it's about 2 years. If someone stays with us about 2 years, they're sticking around. Now, hopefully they're not mediocre. We have that concern, right? Peg talked about that earlier, and we have that concern. But for some reason, when people stay with us 2 years, they're going to stick around. Is it 1 year for you? Is it 5 years? Do you even know? You got to know that stuff, because that's where you can begin to allocate those resources for people that are already in your system to get them to stick around. I also think, I don't like the word retaining. Retaining wall holds back dirt from falling over the side of a hill. We should be talking about developing, not retaining. I used the word retain a lot, but I don't like it. I think we have to talk about developing. What is our development strategy for staff, not a retaining staff, retaining strategy. And also, I think critically, sometimes talking in simple terms is very valuable. And I think if we focus on seeding, feeding, and weeding, seeding people with the best you can find, the 51 percenters, feeding them with good developmental feedback and supervision, opportunities for career growth and development, a good benefits package. And here's the hardest part, get rid of the clunkers. And right now it's hard to do that because you need those bodies. But if you can seed, feed, and weed with some consistent, impactful regularity, you're gonna be much more successful. And part of that equation, I was talking to Robin Pierce, he's on here somewhere, I think, the other day about this, about stay interviews. I mean, those are not earth-shattering, but they're out in the general organizational framework. But do you do stay interviews? Well, we're starting to talk about that now. We really don't do those across the whole organization. We need to do that. We need to figure out, hey, you've been here 3 years now. How's it going? What keeps you here? That's valuable information for the organization. And it begins to address the very specific challenges that Peg outlined in the prior slide. Thanks.
Well said. I mean, the next slide talks about train to retain. I mean, it really is. And that doesn't mean just the mandatories. It means going beyond the mandatories. If you want young people to apply to your job, and you looked at what all the big guys like the Googles and like the ESPN and all of the places where kids would love to be, they all talk about this is more than a job. We're going to develop you. They talk about training, training, training. And for young people, especially today with college as expensive as it is, that we have some opportunities. I exploit that idea of tuition assistance, exploit it. Because for a young person, college in many cases is unaffordable, or it'd pay one course. That's one lesson I have to take a student loan out for. But meanwhile, there's a whole lot of ways to train to retain internally. And I keep telling managers, use your staff meetings, not just as staff meetings, use them as discussion points. Talk about something new, a new approach to what we can do with community inclusion. Talk about what other places are doing. How can we do that? How can we improve it? How can we deal with some barriers and get them out of the way? But people that are learning will stay with you, because they're getting something out of it and they're growing themselves, both personally and professionally. And so you really want to do that at all levels, not just the grand big program, but also right down micro to the program level. Marco, you look like you're going to say something.
Yeah, I love this conversation. So government has not been our friend here. And we all recognize we have to have regulations. We're here to protect people and keep them safe. And we've got lots of government money. We get it. But we have been conditioned to be a transitional training monster, checking boxes by training people left and right, left and right, and left and right. Now, that's an exaggeration, but I don't think it's a big one. A lot of our time and effort and resources in our various training departments are meeting training requirements. And that has really impeded our ability to see training as a beginning, not something that's done. When you're done training, you're not done. When you're done training, you just started, you just began. And I think it's important, again, at the risk of oversimplifying, to think of training as a cycle, but not a desperation cycle. As a cycle, I'm going to call EMO, E-M-O-E. E, educate. M, model. O, observe. And E, evaluate. EMO. If your training approach is EMO, educate, model, observe, and evaluate, you now have a cycle that goes beyond your training department. It goes into the fabric of how your frontline managers interact with your workforce. That's the most important workforce component you have, is how your frontline managers develop, and develop equals retain in this case, and create new leaders if you use EMO. We're now working on what I'm going to call an evidence-based pilot to actually build in real-time developmental feedback with 100 DSPs through a training model. And we're actually going to have supervisors with pads checking in on a few things. How are you instructing? How are you teaching? How are you responding? How are you not intervening when someone's in the community? How are you not doing something for them when they're in the community? And being very specific about those objectives and how they undergird certain critical life elements as we continue to give people a quality of life they choose. We think it's going to have a big impact. We think it's going to scale to a place where it becomes a fabric of how our frontline managers support our workforce, and in turn, how that interaction with the workforce creates a culture of continuous learning. And it may take us a few years to get there, but that's where the commitment has to be. And we're actually, putting resources in to make that thing happen. So you got to start with EMO, educate. What's the next one? Who knows? Model, observe, and then evaluate. Really, really key point to what Peg's saying earlier about train to retrain.
You tested the group. I know
They failed. Nobody said anything. They're all muted. That's fine.
To say the least. Look, I know that there's some people on the call who feel like they're the walking wounded. Like, all this is well said, but you don't know what it's like where we are. And the answer is yes, you're not alone, but you got to put one foot in front of the other. It's about getting to a solution, because you can sit around and feel that it's awful, and it is, but it's not going to get better. And so you've got to work the problem. And that's everybody, even that tired manager on the front line. We all have to be in it together. Go to the next slide, because this is the other thing. I call it initial is official, meaning that an applicant starts the application process. That is the first moment of retention. It really is. The first contact they have with you is another moment of retention. It doesn't start after they start working. It starts right at the beginning of their first association with him. The best thing recruiters can be are happy campers. And the best message is, this is a great job. This is really a great job. When you're scheduling orientation, when people come in, how that orientation is handled. Are they having fun? Because that should be the first day of the first orientation session should actually be fun. People should walk out of there saying, wow, this place is really cool. And that's not by the number of machines you have, and it's not by the materials you've got. It's about the attitude. But and I know, if you've been in the field, I don't have to talk to a single person. I've been a consultant for years. I don't have to talk to a single person. The minute I walk into a building, I can tell you what's going on, because there is an energy or a total lack thereof. And for that new employee that's coming in, if you really want to begin to draw them, and when they go to the program site, they need to be received. That existing staff are not happy to see them because, oh, thank God, I finally have a staff person. but rather this is a great place. Let me tell you about the cool people we work with. Energy's infectious, but it starts at the very first contact.
This is a
Marco.
great point. This is a great point. How many of you have ever worked in an organization or department or job where there was negative energy? And you're all raising your hands now, I can tell, right? Okay, next question. You ready? How many people does it take to create that environment? It takes one. So what I do in orientation, and I bet other people do it too, is I say, don't be that person. If you somehow got past our really good interview process and you are that person, don't be that person. And if you see that person in your midst, let's be supportive. Let's find a way to get them to move in to the positive energy space. And I don't mean smiling all the time. Everything's perfect. Everything's not perfect. But on balance, how do you see the world? How do you problem solve? Are you a problem solver or are you a problem stater? You just talk about problems all the time, or do you come with solutions? That creates an environment of success. And it creates an environment that's really important where there's an expectation to exceed expectations. And I think, as Peg said earlier, it's really important that our outreach and our recruitment and our onboarding conversations and materials talk about exceeding expectations. And that doesn't mean you're working 90 hours a week, although many people are working 90 hours a week. It means having a mindset and a personal commitment and vision to do as well as I can do with my colleagues and team members. So positive energy and exceeding expectations really should be part of the fabric of the organization. And when you create that energy over time, what will happen is your employees will tell other friends to come work here. So it's such a great place. Now that's easier said than done. And we realize the stuff we're talking about today is going to go on like that. But in concert, all of these things can begin to really roll the right way. And I think it's all grounded in, we really have to be very wary of all the transactional elements that get people into the organization. And that's where it stops. It's just all transactional. There have to be these other things Peg has really talked a lot about, and I'm mentioning, that's built in. And that means, who have you assigned in those positions to do that work to get the people in? I love that Peg said earlier, marketing. Your HR staff that are helping with outreach should be marketers. They should tell all the great stories your organization has to inspire people to come and apply for the position. And they should have the impression it's hard to get a job here. I need to be really great to get a job here. That doesn't mean throwing up a wall. It means an excitement around the possibility of working, at the Arc of Westchester, for instance, which is a great place, by the way.
So I'm wanting to leave some time for questions. So I'm just going to brief through a couple of these things. We talked about key data points, but you need to know your stats. What's going on? Why is it going on? The next piece is really about relationships. I don't care all the discussion of retention. If you look at all of the data and all the statistics, people leave because of their relationship with their manager and their peers. It's if they don't have a good relationship with their manager and they don't have a good relationship with their peers, they're going to leave. And it's so important at the program level that people recognize how they talk with one another has a direct impact about the satisfaction people feel about their job. I'm going to say again, the best retention tool is a thank you. I mean, I know that sounds so minute, but just a recognition of what you're going through. The next slide talks about some retention strategies. You can read article upon article about different retention strategies. You go to the next slide. There are tons and tons of research, but I am going to tell you that the research shows that if you're not employee friendly, but your systems need first, it's just like we're person-centered, you have to be employee-centered. You have to recognize where the employee is coming from. And that includes not burning out our A-plussers, because our A-plussers are our lifeline. And during the pandemic and now, I'm seeing A+ DSPs and A+ managers who are burning themselves out because they're burning the candle at both ends. I just did a training and one of the managers was telling me, well, when somebody has a problem at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'd go over and cover for them. And I said, stop, what? Wait a minute. Because she cares with all her heart, but she's going to burn out. And so we have to, everything in perspective in the sense, we've got to tell our A+ers, thank you for what you're doing, but also make sure that they're okay. Because some people will give every ounce of who they are, but they also need to be fed and cared for. And frequent acknowledgement, coming up with goals. I've said, somebody asked me the other day, and I said, even if you every month have a theme, change the perspective for the month. So it's October, go pick apples. You're in New York State, for God's sake. We grow, 60 some varieties of apples. You can even have an apple tasting. Which apple do you like best? There's so many different varieties. Which apple made the best apple pie? I mean, you could come up with enough things to do in 31 days. November's easy because it's all about thankfulness, right? And what are we thankful for? And every day, thank the staff for what they did. I don't know, but to come up with ways to set shared goals, because when people achieve goals, they feel that acknowledgement. And even if I don't achieve a goal, let's say the goal is we're going to do 2 new community inclusion trips this month. That's going to be the goal. Okay. And it snows every day and we can't go out. Okay. I can at least acknowledge that we set the goal and we had some ideas. We just need to postpone it till next month. It's all about energy. So the very last thing that I want to say is that we've got to also deal with the challenge in front of us, which is balancing philosophy and program design. We have some systemic flaws that are going to kill us in the long run. We all know the Justice Center is a problem, but things like how we're funded, the requirement of staffing and minimum staffing requirements, some of it's archaic. Some of it you need. I recognize that. The philosophy of not having facilities near one another, that's all well and good. But if you were running McDonald's and you had a location that didn't make sense, like I'll give you an example, McDonald's now won't create any new locations that's not on public transportation. Because when they looked at the data of who's eating there, it's not people that drive to an outer location. So what locations make sense for us? If you've got staff and public transportation is an issue, you need to look at then, is there walkable distance? Where is density of most people that I would be recruiting or hiring? With gas being as expensive as it is it fair to ask a DSP to basically let's say it takes me a gallon of gas to get out, gas $4 a gallon. It's less than that, but let's say it's $4 a gallon, $8 there and back. That's an hour of pay when you take the taxes out. That's a lot to ask a DSP. Does that location make sense? So some of what we've done philosophically for protection, because of what we believe, and you're talking to a real lefty. I really believe with all my heart that smaller is better. I believe that a multiplicity of options is better. But I also recognize that we do need to do some retooling. We've grown to a point where we need to reassess. And we need to be arguing for more than just wages and wage increases. we need to start arguing about some of the regulations and some of the things that made sense once, but maybe don't make sense anymore.
Peg, that makes sense, by the way. And I think Peg and I both agree, full stop, that we need more competitive wages for our workforce. Absolutely, a living wage and beyond. But if you look at the reasons why people typically leave their job, I think it depends on where you look at the research, but generally, they don't leave because of money. Peg said some of this earlier, leave because of their peers, they don't get along, or their manager. Those are the two things that will kick out one of your staff members. You could lose an A+er that way. So peers and frontline or managers, period. Those are the reasons that people stay or leave, truly. And then another part to this too, and it's been referred to a little bit, all of our organizations have terrific hidden paychecks. What are they? What are the value of your benefits? How much are you paying for your health benefits for your staff member? Do they know how much you're paying versus what they're paying? You should do that calculation. Use your benefits consultant if you have to. Staff should get a periodic annual statement. Here's your hidden paycheck.
Yeah.
You get paid this much, but here's the value, the monetary value of what this organization spends on your behalf. They need to know that, and many of them don't know it. I just pivoted a bit away from money, back to money again. The money does matter, and how you convey it, because it's not just about the dollars, it's your investment. Staff need to know you're investing in them. And I think that that's a really critical thing to be including in here. And then finally, we keep on talking about stories. I'll go back to the McDonald's analogy. I don't particularly care for it either. I think some staff do leave to go to McDonald's. My own quick assessment of that is let them go to McDonald's. And that's easy to say, you're losing staff. I think the more we talk about, and the ARC is good at this, the more that we talk about our impact, not just on people, which is the primary reason we exist, and families, but our local communities and our society, and the power of that in making this a better country in which to live, that's an important narrative too. So when somebody goes to talk about their job, at a barbecue on a weekend, they're talking to a friend of a friend, they're not spending 10 minutes describing what they do. They're talking about why they do it and why they're so jazzed about it. That's your responsibility as a leader to have them tell that story easily. It's really important. We're rethinking how we talk about what we do, and we've kind of gone through a whole stakeholder process. We're landing really on three major values: generosity, curiosity, and optimism. It's easy to say that, I get that, but if that starts to undergird everything we talk about and stuff that we write and people that we use as examples of being generous, curious, and optimistic, we will eventually begin to see a major wave of an even better HRC in New York City, as good as I think we are. So do those hidden paycheck studies. You should know what you're paying. And very importantly, you keep people by the people you keep. And I think that's a very important thing to remember.
So let's take the slides down, and Marco, if anybody has any questions, comments, thank you, by the way, for everything in the chat. That's cool.
Yep.
Yes, the chat has been wonderful. A lot of positive comments. I don't see any hands raised, but if anyone would like to ask a question or give a comment, you can do that now.
Yeah, Bridget, if I can, I'd just like
Sure.
to say to Peg and Marco, I totally agree. And at risk of maybe getting in trouble, it's more than just money. Everyone talks about money, and that's important. A living wage is critical, but I don't think people come into our field thinking I just hit the lottery. They come in because they have a higher calling. And that's what our DSP campaign, our statewide campaign, is all about with Discover the Rewards. Go to discovertherewards.com. It's more than just a paycheck. It's about flexible schedule. It's about great health insurance. It's about relationships with the people you work with and your the people you serve and their families. So it's much more nuanced than just the paycheck.
Agree completely.
Yes. Anyone else before we end the session?
Thanks very much for your attention and your interest. And you know how to get us if you have any questions. or comments. We'd love feedback.
Yes, absolutely. All right,
Thanks,
take
everybody.
care, everybody. Thank you again,
Bye-bye.
Marco and Peg. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
guys. Great presentation. Bye-bye.
Bye.